So this session has the same title as the whole conference, After Audience, and we have two distinguished speakers here, which I will shortly present. The first speaker is Manuel Borja-Villel. He has been the director of the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofia in Madrid since 2008. Previously, he directed the Fundació Antoni Tàpies and the Museo d'Art Contemporani de Barcelona. Alongside searching for new forms of institutionality, an important part of his program is centered on the development and reorganization of the collection, changing the method of presentation of works. I will maybe not enumerate all the exhibitions or the recent exhibitions, and I will also present Stella Rollig, which is not really necessarily here, I guess, but still. So Stella Rollig has been CEO and artistic director of the Belvedere since January 2017. She studied German and art history at the University of Vienna and later worked as an arts journalist. From 1994 to 1996, she was the Austrian Federal Curator for Fine Arts. During this time, she also founded the PO, Kunst und Diskussion, at Museumsquartier Wien, a very important institution for debates up to now. From 2004 to 2016, she was artistic director of the Lentos Art Museum in Linz. And in addition to being a curator, she has taught at numerous institutions. We will do this like that. The two speakers have 15 minutes each for their input, and then we'll have an open discussion with the audience. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say audience, with people participating here. Maybe I shouldn't also say participate. Okay, stop it now. Please, Manuel.
Okay, thank you. We'll have a discussion after the audience. So in any case, I suppose I will have to speak very quickly because I have lots of things. And I don't know how much you know of the background. Obviously, Reina Sofia is where Guernica is, that everybody knows. And it's a national museum, it's a state museum. But the team and some of the ideas that we are developing in terms of proposals of mediation, display, politics, somehow they develop from what actually we did in Barcelona, in MACBA, and in Tàpies before. So it's a continuum. Of course, the historical circumstances have changed a lot from the 90s, where there was in Spain at least lots of optimism, lots of consensus about everything. So we had to be kind of the nasty institution to question that consensus. And things have changed radically after 2008, where things, I mean, neoliberalism, at least in Spain, became really very heavy and became very authoritarian and became very problematic in terms of even freedom. So all that said, I will try to do briefly an account of the situation. I think I've done too much, and then what are the propositions we are doing here. You have the image? In the case, I wanted to show an image of a lecture that didn't happen. So actually, and that it makes some sense. I mean, actually, we did last year an exhibition, of course, on Guernica, which was curated by Timothy Clark, and we deal a lot with the theories and the relationship with the situation now. Not that we are trying to make think that things are similar, but because, you know, if we talk about fascism, then maybe we should talk about neo-fascism today, but it's interesting for us to actually reconsider that. So actually, we were examining the path of Picasso towards how Picasso went to Guernica, how Picasso went to Guernica through a crisis that was personal, it was artistic, and it was political, and we thought that it would be very interesting to do a lecture on Picasso in Malaga. I mean, so far, that's okay. That's part of the exhibition, and I don't have time to explain, but in a way reflect the crisis of art and also the impossibility. There is an element on these works, almost kitsch, almost about the impossibility of art to represent a certain type of politics. And of course, the only difference it was that the lecture was supposed to be in Malaga. but that's also normal because, we're a national museum, we're very nice, we work with different cities because we were very good in the country. And Malaga is a Picasso city. It's obsessed with Picasso. They have a Picasso museum, and actually has become a museum city. I think Malaga is making more museums per year than even China, which is a lot to say. And so you have there the Picasso, the House of Picasso, you have the Russian Museum, you have the Pompidou, that somebody even in Pompidou institution call it Museo a la Plage, the museum for the beach. And you have a center of contemporary art, which is actually quite interesting. Somebody told me that because it's totally privatized, it's in the sense that it's a company that runs the museum, and also that's quite interesting in terms of the economics, which have to do, of course, with tourism, all those things we know. But in the case, it's so extreme that actually somebody actually wanted to hire a transport company and call a number of the transport company, and then when somebody picked up the telephone, in the other side of the telephone said, Center of Contemporary Art, how can I help you? So actually that gives you an idea of how privatized things, and actually so privatized that you don't even need works anymore. It's just the brand. You have a museum with a Picasso museum that has very few works, and actually is easier because the visit is quicker. You have a Russian museum with no Russians, and actually the situation is very similar to, and that's why I wanted to put two things. It's actually very similar to what is happening to the Emirates, to Doha, where you do things for very specific people, for audience, for profiles, not for citizens. And actually the extreme is, of course, Abu Dhabi, Doha, where you have you don't have citizens anymore. The citizens there are only 10% of the population. The rest are workers. And when your labor, very often precarious, as you know, situation finish, you are out. And I was comparing that with Potosí. We did an exhibition called Principio Potosí, because the situation is not so different. In a way, I mean, you have a different type of exploitation, you have a different type of gold coming, but the situation is similar. That's the negative part. The optimist part is that art at the time in Potosí had this ambiguity, and art was an element of conquest, but also was an element of resistance. So how can we do resistance from this element of audiences? How we can go after audience? My idea is that we have to work in different elements. We have to work dealing with agency. We have to turn the audience into the spectator, into an agent, into somebody who is actually active. So that was the first displacement we did. Actually, the only thing that was anormal is that we were not doing the Picasso lecture in the Picasso Museum or in the Center for Contemporary Art or in the Russian Museum. That would have made sense. So how we were doing it in a self-managed center, La Invisible. There is some representative here, and that was an element of distortion. It was an element also of strategy. In a way, is where a national museum, in a way, can sometimes support, sometimes not. Actually, it was so much of a distortion that the speaker got sick and couldn't go. But that's a different story because actually things are complex. So that's the situation, and the situation is actually that the pressures to institutions to have visitors, to have money, are extreme. They are always there, and the pressures are done. That's an account. They are done in many levels. They are done for the way the institution is organized, for the way the city is organized. This is the Crystal Palace, where we do sometimes very critical exhibition, but still, look how the visitors, the one in the left, it was a very beautiful, very complex installation by Lothar Baumgarten, but it was a sound exhibition, but look the way visitors behave. So, And of course, we know the extreme is Venice, where suddenly you have turn whatever you call it, you have this kind of gates to enter. And that, of course, we know it has to do with real estate, and the system actually is so grotesque in a way where you have, in Madrid, for example, you have areas that they are underdeveloped. That's a word by Hans Hacke. And there was some major that thought that by putting names of radical movements to the city, where there was, to the area, there was nothing built. It was just total speculation. Some people had paid for their apartments, but they were not even built. They thought that by putting names like Arte Conceptual, Expressionist Art, Eduardo Chillida Street, that the artists would go, it will be totally gentrified, and of course things would be better, which actually is not true. And the result is that, so that's the outside structure that we all know. The inside structure is that, especially since 2008, things have changed a lot. I mean, legal procedures become much more complex. They are also criminalized in the sense that whatever you do before, I mean, you were fired or you were considered a bad manager, now you could go literally to jail, or you could have a big fine. Actually, myself, I got into trouble for 2 years just because I showed these small matches, box match in a vitrine. It took me 2 years before I could get rid of the request. So what to do in that? Of course, whenever you do any type of criticism, but you do it inside the system, I mean, for benefit, there's no problem. I mean, you could do whatever you like. So what we do in that case? We have a structure that is triple, that has to do with dispositives, it has to do with narratives, but it has to do also with political structure. A political structure that has not been easy. As I said, the things have changed. We developed this political structure 10 years ago when I arrived. With the crisis, things got very difficult, and actually we literally had an attack which, surprisingly enough, didn't come exactly from the government. It came from the government in terms of change of laws, but it came also from within, from the unions, and actually they attack not exactly to exhibition department or to collections, they attack to public programs, to the ones, and actually the department almost disappeared. So the 3 elements we are doing, one is the narrative of the collection. We did a kind of narrative where you have different levels, and how it's very difficult. You question the way myth, the way narratives are being done in Spain, or the way they are structured. So basically, history of art in Spain is still based in this idea of the myth, of the big figures, of these patriarchal figures like Tapies, like Saura, etc., etc. So we put that, but of course we question that. We question showing that they were actually looking to Americans. They were trying to be very local, but they were trying to be international. We question that with somehow questioning the fact of looking, the fact that they are not questioning the aberration of certain type of art, the fact that looking at the time had to do with the Cold War. Here we have a painting by Rothko and Rear Window by Hitchcock. The fact this is a Spanish film by Berlanga, where basically they try to dress and to work and to behave like they expect Americans would imagine, and that's actually what the artists, Spanish artists, they were doing. And of course, we are in this narrative. There are elements that are extremely repressed in Spanish art and culture. So one of them is Sahara. One of them is, so we include these elements in our narratives. That's a Jaima where there was lots of Sahrawi activities. So I'm quitting, I'm skipping. Okay. So very briefly, because I'm running out of time, things that we are trying to do. First, to understand exactly how the system works. the system works first in terms of cultural industry, that means spectacles, that means also anti-ecology, because especially after the crisis, that meant that big institutions, more or less, because we have visitors, we have tourists, we have sponsorships can work, but the smaller institutions, they are disappearing. So that means that that's something we have to take into account and we have to change. So the way to change it is to open our structure and to allow through our structure to support other institutions. For example, we are promoting, they then listen to us, that every time we get a sponsorship, a percentage will go to a smaller institution, so it doesn't need to have, it cannot go in that line of cultural industries. So that's one. And also it will not work in this element of competitivity, this element of visitors, so it's try to develop other areas, point one. Point two, all these structures are based in patrimony. You have patrimony because you show how powerful you are. We are changing that into users, into commons. The way to change it is actually to create, and that's one of the structures we are part of it, is Rede Conceptualismos del Sur, a structure where special archives cannot be fragmented, cannot be sold, and have to be shared with everybody. Sharing doesn't mean only to share the elements, but means also to share the way things are classified, the way things are told, so that means also questioning the way stories are told. Third element, all this structure of terror in a way, of repression, is based on a total lack of transparency. So that means that we need to make an effort to show, and the transparency is not just to show of how good you are. Is the problem of transparency is that people doesn't know how things run. They don't know exactly how things work. When we talk about precarization, they do not know exactly who and why those things are happening. So that's an element we are working as well. Another point is interpellation, is to create areas where those that do not have voice, somehow they could have it. And by having it, it's not just a matter of getting an extra illustration in the big narrative. It's a matter of having independence, of having autonomy, and of questioning the narratives we do. That has to do, for example, that's something we are working with exile, which is been totally, the diaspora after the Civil War, totally disregarded both by leftists living in Spain and of course by rightists, so that's one. Second, the myth of the democratic transparency in the 70s, that's something we are questioning, especially when you have Guernica, which is an icon that runs through all those things. I don't have time to talk here, but we've been working in Guernica, in demythifying Guernica and demythifying the uses of Guernica. Third, autonomy, legal autonomy, and that we work in another moment. We got half through. The museum has autonomy with the exception of labor and relationships, and we are working on that because that's also basic to create a structure. And then a structure that doesn't precarize the system. And then basically to create and that autonomy is important, and here I'm pointing something which is totally contradictory, but that contradiction works. You have Lanzarote, an extreme, you see the picture above, an extreme touristic city, and you have who created that extreme touristic city, which was César Manrique. But through tourism, that institution is able to have complete autonomy, economical and governance autonomy, that allows to question and to actually, they are doing quite an important work to stop many of the terrible things the government is doing. So it's possible to work within and to change these structures. So changes are changing, legal changes, autonomy, changes of sustainability. The museum has to be able to work, and for that we need legal autonomy, changes of narrative, and at the same time a change of structure. A change of structure where somehow we become, that's a national museum, we become some kind of international apatrid museum, where we work in the borders between different institutions. We have established some links with Fundación de los Comunes. Mabel is here, and we can talk later if you like about that. We have talked about Desacuerdos. It's a local institution, a local network, internationally, which is more classical, and what we call institution of radical imagination. That allows for a structure where it could be specific. I mean, you could do a political act, I don't know, in Athens, and at the same time be kind of traditionally in Madrid. It could be solidarity, it could have solidarity in the sense that you could create a structure and then you could support things that it became impossible otherwise. It could become invisible sometimes, could become visible or invisible depending on what you do, and it could question some of the key elements of the system, which is, of course, the property, and is, of course, the canon, the structure that somehow determines some kind of meaning. So this is the way we've been working during these 20 years, and especially in the last years in Reina Sofia, to turn from audience into citizens, into agency, and still be sustainable, still creating a structure that sometimes is visible and sometimes invisible. Thank you.
Thank you, Manolo. Before I give the floor to Stella, I would like to announce something we forgot to announce in the beginning. We have a live streaming here, which doesn't...
No. Sorry, it's not a live stream, it's a video documentation.
We have a video documentation here, and this is the reason that everybody has to also to use the microphone also for in the audience when we have questions. Okay, now, please, Stella.
I think we have to change seats because I think, or we change around the, okay, the turn around the computer. So, okay, let me find my presentation, and then actually I decided not to use it as a slideshow. Okay, I'll let you do it. Ich werde es doch durchklicken.
Ja, okay. So, wir sind am Stick, oder? Wir haben gesagt hier.
Mhm.
Okay. Wir machen es groß. So,
Danke. Yeah, thank you, Manolo. Thank you for having me here. And also third, thank you to pairing Manolo with me or vice versa, because I find after listening to you that it seems to be a perfect match. We share many of the same concerns and the same situation to start with. Well, the Belvedere, and I decided for this short presentation in the beginning to concentrate on one of our venues. As you know, the Belvedere has 3 venues. One is where we're sitting right now, the Belvedere 21, the venue for contemporary art from the 1960s until the very contemporary, the lower Belvedere, where we present about 6 temporary exhibits a year, and the upper Belvedere, where we present our collection. And this venue is actually the one I would like to focus on for this introduction. So our Guernica is obviously The Kiss by Gustav Klimt. And Gustav Klimt, it's a bless and a burden at the same time. Why am I saying this? I should probably point out my very personal credo. I had always believed in having an encounter with art. You need presence and duration. Also Präsenz und Dauer. I think these are 2 very, very important notions when you talk about having a dialogue or with art, having an art experience, and to create the possibility to experience art like this is a very, very big challenge in a building, in a collection that welcomes a number of close to 1 million visitors a year. So as you can imagine. Please keep in mind that other than Manolo, I have been only in this position for 1.5 years now. But I think we have done quite a lot in this 16, 17 months since I came into office. So the Belvedere, let me see, is this working like this? Like this. Well, I was starting with visitor numbers because all of us were suspicious about these figures and these rankings and ratings, etc. But if I tell you another quite personal thing, my professional life has been influenced to a much more degree by this parameter of audience figures than I had ever imagined. I come from art criticism, I come from institutional critique, and my first museum position was at the Lantos Museum in Linz, where we always had to struggle against, not against, it was a pressure put on us from the outside because of, as it was said, low audience figures. And I did not love the pressure, but I have to admit that in very specific situation, I loved it that you could be in a space with an installation by Kathy Wilkes and being maybe with a dozen of other people, and you could really feel the work breathe. And when you compare it to the situation here, you will understand how difficult this is here. Another thing I should want to point out is the demographic structure of our visitors. And now we face the next challenge. It's 90% tourists. We have only 10% of locals or regional visitors, Austrian visitors, people who live, in Austria. But 90% of people coming on a touristic stint to the Belvedere, be it with guided tours, with groups, or be it as individual tourists. But what does that mean? This creates the challenge, the tension, the contradiction that the Austrian gallery Belvedere, which is, I had wanted to mention it before, which is the full name and the dedication of Belvedere, Austrian Gallery Belvedere, an institution whose collection focuses on Austrian art, presents this collection to visitors who might not be familiar at all with Austria, with the tradition, with the Austrian art history, whatsoever. And I might add that the largest number of our visitors, the foreign visitors, come from South Korea. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind. Who are we talking to? Not to pretend we are entering a dialogue with people who are, you have more or less the same experience, the same cultural background, share the same history, but it's people who come from another part from the world, and we do want to give them a lasting experience. And when I came to Belvedere, Belvedere is a success story regarding audience figures. They have been increasing immensely in the last decade or last 15 years. But I found there were almost no information. Where are we here? What is it we are looking at, our visitors? So this was a starting point. And what our reaction was that very soon after I came into office, I developed the idea to install the collection display 100% completely anew, and with an enthusiastic team. I've been very happy, and thank you to all of you who are here. Louis, I see, and all of them. We managed to do this within less than a year. We're talking 3 floors, and reinstart the correction. So, is this going? I know I'm going only back and forth between 2 images. Wo muss ich denn da weiterschalten? And of course, this situation has not developed by itself, or it's Manolo has been talking about it. It's the outcome, it's the result of heavenly city marketing. Vienna around 1900 has become a brand, and the Belvedere, the correction, spans 800 years of art history, art from the medieval to actually to the contemporary. You will see it, although the correction parcours ends with the Second World War, with 1945. But the result of this heavenly branding and marketing of Vienna around 1900 and of Gustav Klimt, the Golden Klimt, leads to the situation that we have a couple of thousand visitors in this one room, sometimes during one weekend, and in the medieval galleries, of course, or in the galleries with Biedermeier, 19th century art, you can have a very relaxed art experience and can have very much duration and presence. Muss ich jetzt da drauf? Also hier, nur hier, Entschuldigung. Ja, the typical photograph, the typical picture. Mario, ich kann nicht gleichzeitig reden und... Nein, ich kann schon. Zeig mir noch bitte einmal, wo ich draufdrücken muss. Gut. Ja, this is how it is. Okay, so much for presence and duration. This is how it is. Look where people are looking to. Well, I see maybe one person, this young lady, who is actually reading the label for a painting. But now I should tell you what have we done. We decided to bring in different levels of access of information. So we started out with, well, at first we decided to stick with a chronological presentation. So if you want to start in the lower right corner on the ground floor, you start with medieval art, and on the second floor in the last room, you will leave the Belvedere with, let's say, 1945. Because this has been proved as to be the most accessible way to present a correction, to have it in a chronological order, but we were not satisfied with this chronological order only. So we decided to interrupt the chronological order with 5 subject-oriented galleries, and these galleries are all dedicated to one question, a question that we share with our audience, with our visitors. And these questions are focusing Austrian identity. And I'm sure that all of us in this space are also sharing a great deal of suspicion towards this word, towards this notion. And we wanted to deconstruct it. What is it? We are the Austrian Gallery. It would not help. I don't even know if we would be allowed to change the name and just say we're not the Austrian Gallery Belvedere anymore, but something else. That's the Federal Museum Austrian Gallery. But how do we deal with this notion of Austrian? So we put a great deal of effort into the short texts on this text displays. It's not necessary to read them now, but the aim was to point out to one fact, one story. Of course, we all know it's a lot about narratives. What story do we tell our visitors? And so the idea was that we have heavily discussed, that it was not without conflict, with the teams of the curators and the teams of art education and myself, that we absolutely and deliberately wanted to shift the focus of the content of these texts from art historian facts to stories about the situation at the time, about the artists, sometimes an anecdote, sometimes just the fate of one painting, to give the visitors one story they can take with them. And we have very, very good feedback to these new installations. And I just want to show you an example. Until this new display, all the paintings by Gustav Klimt, by Egon Schiele, by Waldmüller, a couple of years earlier, or a century earlier, had been put together in one room, in one gallery. And we decided to put the individual works apart and combine them with works by other artists of their time, putting also a focus on women artists. Not easy, as you can imagine, because you rely on the correction of an institution. But I think this is a very speaking display. We have, on the left, we have Egon Schiele, a portrait of his wife Edith. Then we have Richard Gerstl, the Sisters Fey. Then we have two Klimt portraits, Fritza Riedler and Sonja Knips. And then we have, at least a woman artist, Elena Luk-Schmakowska, who actually was in personal very good contact with Gustav Klimt. And on the text panel, you can read that Richard Gerstl detested Klimt, and he absolutely refused to be displayed, his work having displayed close to Klimt. Now this is provocative, because we do it 100 years later, but we decided, yes, we will do it. Now the authority is on us, but we show so much. We do it for the benefit of Gerstl, because it's about from the same time, and when you compare the Sisters Fey to Fritza Riedler, or of course the earlier Sonja Knips, you can really see how radically Richard Gerstl took painting further into modernity. Okay, I will of course not explain you every gallery. Now I don't even have the whole parcours, but this is the one gallery which is subject-oriented. It deals with the myth of the Habsburgs, Austria and the Habsburgs, and please believe me that it takes this myth quite apart. It ends with images of paintings of the very cruel paintings of the First World War. In this collection display, we deliberately decided to have, okay, I have to come to the end, to have less artwork than before. And why? We did it for the benefit to have more transparency, more accessibility to subjects where, I mentioned it in the beginning, where are we here? We talk about the institution, we talk about its history. Well, this space is dedicated to Prince Eugene, and here I have some images. We have newly installed a gallery that you see the vitrines that brings in a timeline that talks about how this institution as a museum, as a landmark, and as an institution has developed with a lot of material from our archives. And now, Manuel, you have mentioned it about talking about diaspora, about exile. Here in this space, it's the gallery that talks about exile, about the time of 38 to 45, the Nazi regime. And we have inserted here contemporary work by Manfred Erjautz, The Broken Existence, of course, is the metaphorical meaning. And this is the one space where we have put more emphasis on biographies and personalities of artists, as you can see in the corner. So I will, here is the exile space. Yeah, maybe only one more subject. This is, we have, within the Baroque galleries, we have one very specific space. It's dedicated to the family of Austrians, a work some of you might know, created by Christian Philipp Müller, the Swiss contextual artist, created in '93 for an exhibition at Galerie Métropole, Georg Kagel, Christian Meyer, and it, referring to the very well-known photo book plus touring exhibition of Edward Steichen, The Family of Men, that was meant as a unifying project after the Second World War, touring the world where all men are family. Christian Philipp Müller deconstructed the imagery of Austrians in this book, and this work, actually this gallery has been curated by Luisa Zeyer together, of course, with the artist, and it has turned out to be very irritating first, but then very, das heißt jetzt lohnend oder very successful in the end to have this exact work there. Okay, and I think it's my last image.
Thank you. Now we would ask for other statements, questions, comments, whatever. You can have them either in English or in German, whatever you prefer, as we have two wonderful interpreters here, which I will present at this point, Herwig Bauer and Alexander Zigo. So when you feel more comfortable speaking German, please feel free.
Guten Tag. Ich habe eine Frage. I could speak English too, but my English is not so nice. So my name is Julia Logothetis and I'm an artist, and I'm interested why you referred in the title of that conference to the year of 68. I couldn't get it by the sort of introduction. What is the connection?
Well, no, there's some confusion in it. We commemorate 50 years of 1968, but the spirit of 68 is the title for the overall program this year in Belvedere 21. And unfortunately, from my point of view, I had only 15 minutes in the beginning, so I had no chance to talk about Belvedere 21 at all. But what we do here and what was very dear and important to me is to establish a public program here at Belvedere 21, a public program in its own right. This is the first year we're doing it, and of course we're continuing it in the years to come. Not an accompanying or art education program, we do have that as well, but a discursive program in its own right. And Spirit of 68 is, well, actually it has a much more beautiful title that Luisa found, Gemeinsame Wagnisse. How did we translate it? Joint ventures. Ah, that's Joint ventures. Yeah, such a great title. But still, I mean, it is connected. So this conference by eipcp is still part of, or fits very well into this overall program, because, to me it's quite obvious, all of this, the subjects, these ideas, the question, who is the audience and who are we, who are the others, what is an institution, who speaks, we know all this has started out in 1968. Or what we, it's not a year, but what we associate with 68.
Maybe it also helps to read the abstract of the conference again. There is, it is there in German, at least on the web. I want to ask a question to the both of you, of course, with very different positions then in your different museums. I think I'm trying to force you to put more flesh on the table for the conference, which might be also good concretization of what we are going to talk afterwards. So my question is first to Manuel to speak a bit more about this at least the two things you were showing on the diagram. One thing is the relationship that you called an older marriage before we started the conference, the relationship between the Museo and the Fundación de los Comunes, and then even more interesting, the new one, the Institute for Radical Imagination. So a bit more what it is, and to Stella maybe the question, why is there not at all such a thing, and you don't even have to talk about Belvedere, you could speak about the, let's say, Austrian or German-speaking museum situation. Why is there such a shying away from composing other forms of constituencies that are not kind of fixated on questions of audience and audience figures?
Okay. Yeah, sorry, before I had to speak very quickly. I mean, you know, this is like, we are all in chemicals, so for me it was like a tachycardia, for you almost sleeping. So I will try to answer to that, but let me say a few things also to relate to what Stella has said. First about the public. I think the public or audiences or whatever, they are not sometimes as stupid as we think, but sometimes they are. I mean, I was in the Tapies Foundation, and we had 3 floors, and during the Olympics we did, I will go back to the Comunes eventually. During the Olympics we did an exhibition on by Christoph that was questioning all these big things of Barcelona being a beautiful city, etc., etc. But always we left 1 floor for Tapies, because, you know, he was the founder, he was the permanent collection. So eventually I went to the galleries and we had tourists. I mean, it was the Olympics, we had guides. So I find this group of tourists being by a guide talking in front of a homeless vehicle by Bodichko. But the guide didn't really, I mean, she saw only Tapies, so she thought everything was by Tapies. So she was talking about the matter, I mean, she had learned the lesson about the matter qualities of the homeless vehicle. So that gives you, I mean, so, and I think the spectators, actually, they were asking the spectators, the visitors, quite critical, nice questions. So probably the problem is the mediator. which, is like, so, and I think we have to change then a mediation that has to do with profiles. And as you know now, audiences mediator is even is of course a profession, but it's even a field of research. It's even in the ICOM, and they're actually very happy to say that they are tired of this type of boring exhibitions and that they have to work in profile, they have to work on how to secure visitors to go, etc., etc. So for that, I think it's very important complexity against, and the complexity this means many levels of demythifying, many levels of the fetishization. Case of Guernica, one is to talk about the materiality of the painting, what it means to do this type of painting in the 30s. Another level is to relate it with the pavilion of the Spanish Republic and what it means with the cultural wars of the time. Another level is into the exile. I mean, Guernica was a symbol against the Vietnam War, etc., etc. Another level is it was a transition for democracy, what it meant, I mean, how it was changed. So all the levels could be there in a few rooms, and all the levels do not imply to have a bigger, a genius in terms of audience. You could have a regular visitor, you could have a tourist, whatever. I mean, and those things, I think, they are there. So, but it's important to have this mediation, but it's also important to have intermediation. Is also important to have an interpellation, and there is where the Commons, the Fundación de los Comunes came. We've been working with, especially, and the IRI, we've been working with the idea of the commons. We've been working with self-managed, I think you call it like that in English, organizations like Invisible, now like Tabacalera in Madrid. And why? What is important, or what is what can we help? First, in spite of everything, in spite of this self-critical, the capacity of the system, as you know, to absorb everything is enormous. I was telling Kiki, I was sitting in a dinner with the mayor of Malaga, and I was trying to convince him all the way through the dinner about the goodness of La Invisible, and they should not close it, etc., etc. And at the end, his answer was, okay, I'm convinced, but tell them they should do well what they are doing, because they represent Malaga, they represent the... So of course, and for that, I think it's important to create this complex structure of the commons, because the commons somehow is unpredictable. Somehow you reorganize themselves constantly, and that's our link. For example, in Tabacalera, another one of part of the Fundaciones de los Comunes, somehow the Ministry of Culture gave it to us, a part of it, and of course it was, first they were threatened, because if you know Madrid, that and La Ingobernable are the two only elements that in the mile of the arts, I mean, you only have those two elements to have everything else totally gentrified. So for them it's like a, how do you call it, a pebble in the stone, in the foot, I mean, it's really in the shoe, it's really a problem. So then with Tabacalera, the idea is that we work together to keep them as their case, not as their structure, their legal status, not as an artistic institution, but they are now a social institution. So to keep that and to prevent certain type of things. So this is the way we are working. The same thing with Fundación de los Red de Conceptualismos del Sur that is working. And they are in a way monstrous structures, in the sense that sometimes we support them when we had money, sometimes not. They were with us, but they are totally autonomous. We appear, we disappear. In that sense, with Fundación de los Comunes as an umbrella, yeah, maybe we are in a kind of long marriage crisis. I mean, so we have to, we actually were talking this morning, we have to think about our relationship. But it's because politics have changed a lot, and you know, it changed last week. It's changed a lot in Spain, in Europe, very quickly. And especially after 2008, it became literally a criminalization. It became very difficult to do anything. And so in a way, sometimes our interests, sometimes our interests were survival for a while. So it became very difficult to them. Also, as you know, after the crisis, some city halls were taken by local movements, many of them Fundación de los Comunes. So in a way, we got, it was a complex situation. They were now institutional, and sometimes they are more difficult. Sometimes friends become more difficult to deal with than enemies in a way, because you forget that you could be in a city hall, but still the laws are there, and the capacity of maneuver are not that big, and then you are compelled to do the law against your own. So it becomes complex. And so that means that in a way we have to redefine the situation. That's one. Second, the IRI, the Institute of Radical Imagination, that is based in Mediterranean. Somehow it's a nomadic group. It doesn't have a base. It's a group which is very uneven. You have people like ex asilo in Naples, like Sale in Venice, or like Salt in Istanbul, or Laboratory of Urban Commons in Athens. So that uneven structure is something important because it allows a permanent interpellation. It becomes this kind of erratic structure. That's one. It's also a group of that could have different. It's a group of a think tank in a way, but it's also a group where different elements will be thought. Terror, which is especially if you go in the other side of the Mediterranean, also to deal with the Mediterranean, which is becoming, it was the origin of Western civilization, and now it's like the big coffin of Western civilization, I think is key, and to deal with realities which are very different. So terror is one. Tourism, of course, and all this culture is another one. And then education, radical education is another one. And what does that structure allows? It could allow for a structure of solidarity where things could be distributed, and also it could allow for a very specific politics in every place. In front of this kind of universal structure of museums, an action could develop in Athens, could be related to Madrid, but it could be totally different. So that's, and that's in process, actually. We started, as you know, IRI 1 year ago.
Stella first. There was a question to Stella as well.
I'm drinking your water.
You should repeat the question.
It is on the ground of what Manolo just said. There are different tries to open up the museum's competencies and the power relations to other forms of institutions, or not even like monstrous institutions, as Manolo called them.
Yeah, of course, or maybe not of course, but we did concentrate in this first, I was saying 16 months or 18 months, to start, let's say, on site and with the institutional structure on site. And I should also mention that the Belvedere has a research center, and we put much emphasis on it. We have hired Christian Huema from Getty Research to strengthen the part of the research in the museum. And the outcome after a year is already that we have changed to open content policy. So, for example, it's only one example, all the images in our collection, they used to be the rights, the reproduction rights used to be sold. Now it's an open content policy, you can just download them. And the Belvedere is actually the first art museum in Austria who is doing this. We are staging conferences. We will have a conference on the art market in fall. We will have a conference on the digital art museum in January. And here in Belvedere 21 from fall on, I think it's much about giving space. And we will have here, when you see the the lower floor, the basement, in a moment, in the break. This space, there used to be a restaurant, and the restaurant didn't really work. So what we decided is that we will have a bar here later on where we are now, on the ground floor, and the lower space will not be turned into another exhibition space or something, but we have hired a new colleague, Christiane Erharter, who will start in October as an, well, we haven't maybe found the ideal name, so we adopted the name in the American speaking world, a curator for community outreach, because we think a lot about our relation to what is happening here. You see the construction site, it's a whole new part of the city, a whole new neighborhood. But what we see here, this is the corporate world. There's Erste Campus, the bank, there's this is very high-priced apartment buildings. There will be a conference hotel in front, and behind, what you cannot see from here, unfortunately, is a very lively new neighborhood, the Sonnenwendviertel. So what we want to do is establish relations with people here in the neighborhood and beyond, and just provide space, like the basement. But what has to be done, absolutely, but it will be a next task, is to establish this international point of view and relations that you have, which I find very, very interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to point, I keep forgetting all the time. I mean, you have to base this international with element of, I would not like the word proximity because it sounds like community, blah, 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 but yes, local. And locally could be extremely precise. This is something we're developing lately, I have to say, because the museum has become, in Madrid, is like a fortress physically even. And now we've been working with the associations, with the groups of Lavapiés, the neighborhood where we live, and trying to do, working with them what they want from the museum, which is, of course, eventually to see Guernica, but they want other things which are more practical and more urgent for them. Like, for example, and that's more difficult legally, we are working on that, to be a refuge when for the guys that put in the blankets the things and the police comes, to be an element, to be able to use the library that we achieve when you don't have documents. So finally we achieve a system where they could come and to do it, to do a program of cinema, in this case, of their neighborhood, and to occupy, when the museum started in the late 80s, 90s, and it was, former original socialist government, the museum was free, and the square where the museum, the garden that museum had, it was free. It was actually, you could, it became later on paying garden, and also when terrorism, I mean, you had to have all kind of scanners, so it became even more difficult to enter. So we are doing with them a system where at least the neighborhood could come free to do all those things. So this extreme precise local elements are also very important.
I would ask actually my question for both of you, but I'm especially motivated by you, Stella, your story about tourism industry occupying the spaces of art, of museums, of artistic presentation. I felt in your talk this tension between, on one side, this old normative framework, like Austrian museum, on one side, and this pressure of tourism as commodifying the exhibits you have in the museum. It's extremely difficult to reconcile this old framework, which is national, of course, and this process of commodification. Can you think of one certain point at which no reconciliation will be no longer possible, when it will be like torn apart into two totally empty empty elements. And to put it more concretely, what is commodified is not actually the art in the museum, but it is the notion of heritage that commodified the art. So it is first the heritage and then the art, what is perceived. So how you guys deal with this falling apart of a space of museums being, from one point commodified, then normatively enclosed and heritage, and then still claiming some sort of art experience?
Yeah, I think we've talked about this. I mean, first and foremost, it's, and now this is a slogan from the corporate world, so it's a little embarrassing to use it, but it's all about people. So the tourists, these individuals, and I will not stop to see them as individuals. And this is how we have developed the texts in this new element. So talk from one person to another, and it's not simplifying. It's just like we enjoy talking to knowing people. So like, did you know that? Or in that sense, and we are working against this superficial commodification of the heritage, the history, with these subject-oriented galleries where we talk about what is it actually, what makes Habsburg myth so fascinating. What is it, and what were the political inclinations behind, and we are addressing all this, and then it's in the details. Yeah, before. Maybe this sounds banal to you, but still we have to start with regarding details. Like before, there were no seating options, no chairs in the museum. So the museum gallery was not meant as a space to stay and to, again, this notion of duration. So the aim obviously was that you walk through as fast as possible, and now we have added benches in all the galleries. So we lose space for larger groups, but it's more for the individual. We have emptied another gallery which will open as a new studio in fall for every possibility to gather, like for kids to play, for an improvised discussion or a stage lecture, or could be anything, and that hasn't been there before.
Yeah, I think in a way, I think we actually the dystopia is already there. You see it, and the dystopia has to do with two elements. One, which is actually, because art is too complex in a way, is emptying the museums of art. I mean, you look Malaga, I mean, you just need a name. I mean, nothing else is simple, it's easier. Actually, I was in Tokyo a few years ago, and there was an exhibition of Leonardo da Vinci. I went in to see it. Actually, I didn't notice, I had time, so I didn't know exactly what I was seeing. Actually, I arrived more or less at the end of the show, and basically discovered that it was like one drawing or two or something, and the rest it was how the videos about how the exhibition was done, videos of the sponsor, and also when I arrived, because it was late, it was a facsimile. It was not even, it was nothing. So actually you can do, I mean, you don't need art. I mean, you can do things, why to bother? I mean, so that's one problem. So actually we have to do art. I have to defend it in that sense. Second, the other problem, the other dystopia that exists is Doha or Dubai. I mean, there you have exhibitions of major artists, Tillmans, with great curators, and actually they are done. I think it was Tillmans, the one that everything was from a gallery, everything was for sale. So actually it was a private exhibition done by the foundation of Qatar or whatever, done to do an exhibition to see what they are going to buy. So that means that first, to attack this labeling, this branding, you have to do complex, you have to deal with art, and the other, you have to question property. I mean, that's the basic, art belongs to everybody. So that's something that we have to deal when we work. And second, I don't have nothing against tourists, I mean, because, I mean, let's don't do with tourists like we are doing with immigrants. I mean, I have a lot against tourist industry. I mean, Goethe was a tourist. I mean, it depends how you visit or how you deal with, I mean, or vacation. I mean, after all, it was something that it was a reivindication of the Front Populaire. I mean, but the problem is the industry, the problem is the alienation, and there is where we have to attack. Of course, we don't do the laws. I mean, we work there, but of course the laws, they are not totally always perfect. So you can work, and to work, I think, when you are a national museum, you have to work with to deal with the idea of identity, especially in Spain. You have to deal with the idea of notions of state, and you have, I think, to go in two extremes. One extremely complex international, and then very local. To me, those are the solutions, I think.
I would add something. We haven't talked so much about exhibition programming. I mean, you did it with the Picasso project, but that's another important aspect. And I just want to point to one exhibition we have up right now. As all of you know, 2018, it's not only commemorating 50 years of 68, but it's also commemorating the death of Klimt and Schieland in 1918. So everybody expected the big Klimt exhibition at Belvedere. And actually what I found in programming plans when I arrived in the beginning of 17 was another Golden Klimt exhibition. And I said, let's stop that project. It's not interesting. This is the commodification of Klimt. But what is, let's step back and conceive of another project that is much more interesting. And what we did is an exhibition up right now. It's called Beyond Klimt. And it looks at a time that's not very sexy, not very glamorous in the first moment. We look at the centers in Central Europe, like Belgrade, like Prague and Budapest, but also Pécs and smaller cities. What has happened there after 1918? We call it, it's a bit of a trick maybe, but in German it's called Klimt ist nicht das Ende. Klimt is not the end, which is maybe even more provocative. So we introduced an entire generation of artists, again many women artists from Central Europe who are very little well known. So we lure our audience or the public into this exhibition with Klimt in title. I admit that we do it like that, but then we introduce them to a part of art history, to the work of individual artists who have not yet been known so much.
Yeah, I would like to point two things. One is that there is myths also that we work with, is that big museums, conservatives, they are good managers, and there we are very bad in managers, and normally to do complex exhibitions, it means that nobody will come, and it's not true. I mean, that's also what we have to show. I had an epiphany 15 years ago when I was reading the sport section of a newspaper in Spain, and they had devoted literally like 2 pages of the newspaper to Romario, the soccer player, because he fainted a little bit. So actually they were totally obsessed if he fainted in this place, or he was. So when you can, and actually I was reading it with lots of interest. So if you can do a story about such a stupid things, I mean, certainly you can do. So that means that it's possible to communicate. It's really possible. I mean, good management is not a property of the right. So that's one element. And second, which I think is very important, we also have this still modernist idea that the institutions are isolated, which they are, but in a different way. I mean, and that you have, you do things, but we depend a lot on newspapers, on social networks, blah, blah, blah. I mean, for example, this silly thing with the matchbox actually became a big thing because a journalist took it. So I think it's also very important to do alliances, not only between us, but also with media, with other type of politicians. I think it's very important to realize that those things cannot be done isolated, because the world is not isolated.